All right, guys, a couple of things before we get started today. Your assignments for this week, you have Journal 16, which should go through the notes that we have this week and the readings that are in the assignment. You also have the jungle activity. You'll be reading an excerpt from the jungle. Make sure that you answer the questions in 3 to 5 complete sentences and use evidence from those readings. All right, we are going to look at another reform movement today. So, in the beginning of this unit, we looked at the agrarian movement. Then we went into the populist party, which is the populist movement or populism, if you will. And now we're going to look at another reform movement. The goal of this is, as we're looking at all of these different reform movements, that we look at what eventually will build the progressive movement. Each of these pieces are a part of a larger puzzle. I want to take you back in time a little bit and recap where we last left off with women's rights and the role of women. So, we're really going to go back in time. I want you, as you watch this, coming up with a definition for Republican motherhood that you can share with a partner next to you.
At the end of the war, what is obvious is that the old colonial idea that women's brains are weak and they're incapable of making political choices or moral choices, rational decisions, is obviously not true. Women have taken sides in the American Revolution. They've made sacrifices. They've risked their life. And it's obvious that they have acted on political loyalties. So when the war is over, the question becomes, so where do they fit into the republic? Where do they fit into this representative government? So it's not as if after the revolution, the leaders of the country are going to say, ladies, you were so good, we're going to make you citizens, and would you like to run for office? They do begin to think that women can play what they call a civic role in the new republic. How are we going to sustain this new republic? Through patriotism. The next generation of men have to prove to be good patriots. And here is what women can do. Women can raise patriotic sons. In a sense, they politicize mothering. Being a good mother becomes a political act. Now, Republican motherhood, which is what they call it, not as in the Republican Party, but the Republic, suggests that every time a mother tells her son, you must be willing to sacrifice for your country, you must believe in your authority in society, that they are doing something that is political. It doesn't mean they have economic independence. It doesn't mean they have political rights themselves. It doesn't mean that they leave the household. But it means that what they do in the household has a civic component. We now agree that they have brains, that they can make political choices, that they can be patriotic. And this elevates, in some sense, the status of women from simply household manufacturers and producers of children to citizens in the new country. They're not full citizens, but they are doing civic duty.
Okay, I want you to take about 30 seconds here and turn to your seat partner and share your definitions of Republican motherhood. All right, so the idea of Republican motherhood really came after the American Revolution. And if we go all the way back to this time period around 1790 when the Constitution is being ratified, we're trying to figure out what is the role of women. Because we know that the role of men who own property and are white is going to be to vote, is going to be government officials, but there is this question mark of what happens with women. And the American Revolution, if we remember, was fought for liberty and equality. Not for everybody, right? We don't want to go too crazy there, but it does inspire people to turn their attention to other avenues of who has liberty and what does equality look like. And this idea of Republican motherhood comes out of that. And initially, the idea was, well, we can't give women the right to vote, but they're asking for some kind of role in this society, so we have to do something. And it gives women this purpose beyond just raising children, but to say you're raising your sons to carry on this republic, and it gives some ownership to the role of women that really wasn't changing. We're not giving them any other role, right? We're just saying those sons that you're raising, make sure you raise them right because they need to be intelligent and responsible citizens. And really who we're talking to, it's not all women. Again, it's a smaller portion of the population where it's wealthy families that have these Republican mothers, because those would be the men that would go on to participate in our government. Also, during the revolutionary era that starts to question this role of women was an essay that was written by Judith Sargent Murray called On the Equality of Sexes. And what she did was try to define the order of nature and say there really is full equality between the genders. People are people, and really what we're looking at is people are equal to each other in this order of nature. Now, this was a mind blowing proposition when she writes it. And it doesn't really pick up speed, but it does plant a seed, just like the American Revolution did, of wait, are men and women really equal? And if they are, then maybe we need some adjustments made not only to society, but our Constitution to award these rights. To continue with this time period around the revolution, around the time that the Constitution is being passed, I want to go back to a very infamous letter by Abigail Adams written to her husband, John Adams, in the midst of the American Revolution. I want you thinking about these questions. What does she ask for? What is the point of view of Abigail Adams on the people when we're talking men versus women? And what is the purpose of this letter? So she says, they have time and warning given them to see the evil and shun it. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to form a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it on the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity, with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as vessels of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection and an imitation of the Supreme Being. Make use of that power only for our happiness. I want you to turn and talk with your partner. Maybe pick a different partner this time, turn the other direction, and take about a minute here and talk about what does Abigail Adams ask for? What's her point of view on people? And what's the purpose of this document? Okay, so ultimately, I hope you guys got to the fact that Abigail Adams is asking her husband to quite literally just remember that there are women in this country that have not had a voice and do deserve a voice. And now is that crucial time when you should be remembering them as you are creating this new government or code of laws, as she refers to it as. And her point of view is really that men have kind of screwed things up in the past. We know that they're tyrannical. We know that they are not good. We know that they can become these beings that nobody really wants to follow because they're not very nice. If you look in the past, as she's looking at the history, it's not queens that are being these tyrants, it's kings. And she says maybe you could get a little women voice in there and it wouldn't be so bad. And the purpose here is really to get the men to think of the women as they're creating this new government. All right, I want you to take a listen here, and then I promise there will only be one more video at the end of class today. And I want you to think about the relationship between the women's movement and the abolitionist movement. And if you remember, abolitionists were fighting to end slavery, right? So now we're moving forward in the timeline, but only slightly here to compare and contrast the women's movement and the abolitionist movement.
I think abolitionism was a great seedbed of the feminist movement. And I say this because in the Abolitionist Convention of 1840, the Anti-Slavery Convention in London, women were allowed just to sit in the galleries behind a curtain. They weren't allowed to actually have a voice in the main convention. They could kind of sit up there and just kind of listen to it. And this really got a lot of these women angry, and people like Lucretia Mott, several others that were at that convention, got together and said, you know, this is wrong. We have to not only fight against slavery with our fellow abolitionists, we have to fight against the enslavement of women. You had the rise of the women's rights movement. So you have the first women's rights convention in the world that occurs in upstate New York in Seneca Falls in 1848. And they rewrite the Declaration of Independence to say that all men and women are created equal. Not just men, all men and women are created equal. And they begin to call for the vote. Of course, the vote doesn't come until 1920, much later on, but you begin the movement for the vote for women, for increased property rights for women, for increased employment opportunities for women.
But they also move into other issues at the same time. They move into temperance issues. They look at male drunkenness. They looked at the amount of money that goes into the saloons. They see this as not simply a moral issue, but as it were an economic injustice perpetuated against wives, perpetuated against daughters. Get the men out of the saloon and you'll have more money for the family. Some of them will move into missionary efforts. But by the very end of the 19th century, some of the women involved in the women's movements will also move into urban reform. And they'll take on issues of children, they'll take on issues of mothers' health, and help make cities places where people can eat wholesome food, where they can be safe in their jobs. So they become one of the spearheads of progressive reform. And it's that social ambition that goes together with their ambition for the suffrage that really defines the women's movement by the early 20th century.
Okay, so take about 30 seconds here. Maybe this time get up and find a different partner, or just sit there and talk to the same person. What is the relationship between the women's and abolitionist movement? All right, so you could have a couple different relationships here. First relationship you could have is cause and effect. As we look at the abolitionist movement, there will be women who were leading abolitionists. You saw some of these names in the video there: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Lucretia Mott. These women will have pushed for the abolitionist movement, but they weren't really allowed to participate when it came to the more general conversations. And that's going to be incredibly disappointing for these women who were working to end slavery. But then when it comes time to have the big meetings, they were told to sit behind the curtain and listen. No need for you to speak. And what this will push to, and why I say a cause and effect relationship exists here, is these leading abolitionists that were women are going to try to link suffrage rights for African Americans and women. The other relationship that you could have here is the similarity. Both movements, the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement that we'll label the women's movement here, they're both fighting for suffrage, which is the right to vote. Now, what's going to end up happening with this linkage between the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement is they don't work, right? The problem is, at the time when you have the abolitionist movement pushing through with the Civil War and the unrest that is in the country, basically they're going to say, if you want, you either need one or the other. And what is more likely to pass right now is the suffrage rights for African Americans. So there is no linking suffrage for women in this time. I want you to take a look at the image that is on the screen, because we've seen this in a very similar way before. It says, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" The flip side of this is that you've probably recognized. It usually says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Josiah Wedgwood was a famous potter and abolitionist, and he produced this image of the male slave in chains with the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" That was used in the abolitionist movement. And later on, women campaigners are going to produce a very similar and wear it as a brooch, the caption, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" to show the linkage between these two. The women's movement is going to continue to progress as we move through the end of the Civil War into Reconstruction, which, if you think of the time period here, Civil War ends around about 1865, Reconstruction moves into 1877. This time period that we're overlapping with is the Second Industrial Revolution, and during that time period, we know that women are going to start to work more outside the home. The issue with this, the factory conditions are already terrible enough. Women are going to lack political representation because they don't have a vote, which means they don't have a voice. This puts them in a very different class as a worker, because they often were not asked to join any of the unions. They were seen as less than. They were paid less. They experienced worse conditions in the factory because these owners knew that women were not going to have a voice. Politicians are not looking at women and saying, "Man, let's pass some legislation that makes life better for women." We've been asking for it since Abigail Adams wrote that letter in 1776, and nothing has changed. So again, you see that the women's movement will begin all the way back with the abolitionist movement, but no traction is gained, and it only worsens during the time period that we just went over in that second industrial revolution. Now, I promise this is the last video of the day. We have one more slide and then we're going to call it quits. But I really want you to take a listen here on the road to the 19th Amendment and look for different pieces that described the effort to gain women's rights. What were they doing? How were they doing it? Where was it occurring? When was it occurring? And keep these ideas in your mind and write them down in your notes.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. No, that's not the Declaration of Independence. It's actually from the Declaration of Sentiments, a document signed at the first ever Women's Rights Convention in 1848. Back then, women in the U.S. weren't allowed to do a lot of things men were, like vote, and it would take them another 70 years to be granted that fundamental right. Why? Well, many thought encouraging women's involvement in politics would undermine society. The prospect of women voting was threatening to the white men who held power. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided to organize factions across the country that were campaigning for suffrage, or the right to vote. The convention at Seneca Falls, New York, addressed women's rights and inspired other conventions and meetings. Stanton considered it the beginning of the women's rights movement. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was introduced, which would give black men, but not women of any color, the right to vote. Suffragists were split. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the amendment, objecting to the exclusion of women. They formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, hoping to pass a constitutional amendment that included women. Others, like abolitionists Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, supported the 15th Amendment. They founded the American Woman Suffrage Association and lobbied for the women's right to vote on a state level instead of through a national amendment. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Black men could vote, but women still couldn't. In 1878, a women's suffrage amendment penned by Susan B. Anthony was finally proposed in Congress, but it was defeated on the Senate floor in 1887. In 1890, the separate suffrage movements merged, opting to tackle suffrage by state in the wake of the federal amendment's defeat. Within 6 years, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho granted women the right to vote. Wyoming had already done it in 1869. Around the same time, the National Association of Colored Women was formed, bringing together more than 100 black women's clubs. It included leaders Mary Church Terrell, Josephine Silent Yates, and Anna Julia Cooper. By the turn of the 20th century, the women's suffrage movement had gained renewed momentum. Parades, marches, and pickets drew great attention to the cause. Between 1910 and 1918, a number of states and territories expanded voting rights to women. In 1912, 15,000 suffrage supporters took to the streets of New York City. But as women's political power grew, so did the danger they faced. In 1913, on the eve of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, hundreds of women were injured in a massive suffrage parade in the nation's capital. In November of 1917, 33 suffragists were arrested outside the White House. The women were clubbed, beaten, and tortured by prison guards at the Occoquan workhouse. One of the movement's leaders, Alice Paul, founder of what became the National Woman's Party, was placed in solitary confinement in order to break her will and undermine her credibility. But press coverage of the women's treatment increased sympathy for their plight. And in 1918, Representative Jeanette Rankin, the first woman in Congress, opened congressional debate on a women's suffrage amendment. The resolution failed. In 1918, President Wilson also came out in favor of suffrage, declaring it was needed as a war measure. Wilson argued that women had been providing vital roles during World War I, and that their votes should be counted in order to make the world safe for democracy. Finally, in 1919, the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment, the same one written by Susan B. Anthony back in 1878, was passed by the House and the Senate. And on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially incorporated into the U.S. Constitution, prohibiting denying the vote to a U.S. citizen based on gender, although states could still deny voting rights based on other things. It would take another 4 years for Native American women and men to get the right to vote, and more than 30 years before major restrictions were lifted on Asian American voting rights.
Okay, I want you to think about the different avenues that were just posed to you as women worked to gain women's suffrage. You heard that there were state initiatives, there were amendments proposed to the Constitution, there were marches on Washington, there were groups that were formed to advocate for the rights of women. Women were punished in a sense as they moved closer and closer to getting this suffrage. And you heard there with Alice Paul, I'm going to plug a movie here. It's called Iron-Jawed Angels. It's about the arrest of the women who were pushing for women's suffrage during that time. And there's a lot of layers to it, and we'll get more into it tomorrow. But at the height of the women's suffrage movement, we were in the middle of World War I. And it's not really great when you're fighting for democracy around the world to have people challenging your democracy here at home. So women were thrown into jail, and they were mistreated as they were in jail. And that movie, Iron-Jawed Angels, really goes into that. But the effort to gain women's suffrage really started with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Now, I would put a star next to this in your notes because Seneca Falls is in New York, and you're going to take a New York State Regents, and they really like to ask about New York State history on that Regents. So 1848, we're going all the way back to when the discussion is happening on should we have slavery, should we not have slavery, the decade leading up to the Civil War. Now, this is where you start to see the women's movement break off from the abolitionist movement. The Seneca Falls Convention is really the marking of the beginning of the official movement for women's suffrage. The leaders are Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. Their goal at this convention was to discuss the issues of women. Now, the laundry list is long. It goes beyond women just having the right to vote. Women wanted the right and protection when it came to divorce. Women wanted the right and protection to have their children if in such a case of divorce. Women also wanted the right to land. If they were married and their husband died, oftentimes that land went to the next male of kin. It could be a brother of the husband. It could be a son. It didn't go to the women. How fair was that? So you're looking here, and when we say the issue of women, yes, they want the right to vote. They want a voice in the government, but it goes much beyond that as well. What gets written here at the Seneca Falls Convention, and again, you want to put a star next to this because this is a big one, it's called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And if alarm bells are already going off that it sounds like something we've gone over already, you're correct. The Declaration of Rights and Sentiments was written by these women to discuss the issues that women were facing in the nation. They modeled it after the Declaration of Independence. They modeled it in that way to kind of thumb their nose at the men and say, you know what, when this country was started, you wrote a Declaration of Independence that went through all the wrongs that you were experiencing in this country at the hand of a tyrannical government. Here we are again, and we're going to write you the same document to make you see that women have not gotten out of this tyrannical era that the revolution was fought for. The Declaration of Rights and Sentiments argues that women should have the right to vote, that women should be respected by their government, that laws should be altered to show value to women. And they model it in the same way that the Declaration of Independence was. It is a list of grievances against a government that has wronged them and the changes that they want to see made, or else they're going to start fighting for it. And they're going to fight not necessarily in the same way that the American Revolution was fought, but they are going to fight. They're going to go back to what Abigail Adams said, and they're going to cause a rebellion against this government unless they are respected. Tomorrow we'll continue with where we go in the women's movement from the Seneca Falls Convention moving forward, but we are going to pause here for today. You should have a few minutes if you would like to get started on your readings for this week. There should be at least one on the women's movement as well, and I will see you guys tomorrow. As always, any questions, let me know.